When we study human psychology closely, one thing becomes extremely clear. People are not reacting to reality as it is, but to reality as they interpret it. And interpretation is shaped by emotion first, logic second. This is why two people can experience the same situation, but walk away with completely different emotional outcomes. The mind is constantly scanning for safety, familiarity, and emotional alignment. Even before conscious thinking begins to process information, a person's internal emotional state acts like a filter. When someone feels secure, their behavior becomes open, relaxed, and receptive. But when there is uncertainty or emotional discomfort, the same person may become distant, defensive, or overly analytical. This shift is not intentional. It is a protective mechanism built into human psychology. The brain is designed to prioritize emotional stability over everything else, even truth. Another important factor is emotional memory. Human beings do not respond only to the present moment. They also respond to what they have felt in the past. If a certain type of behavior once created discomfort or confusion, the brain stores that pattern and becomes more cautious in similar situations. This is why emotional experiences often repeat themselves in cycles until awareness breaks them. Communication alone is never enough if emotional energy does not match the words. People naturally trust consistency over explanation. When words and behavior align, the mind relaxes. When they do not, doubt begins to grow silently, even if nothing is openly said. This is where most misunderstandings in human relationships are born, not from conflict, but from misalignment. Over time, emotional patterns become stronger than intentions. A person may want closeness, but if their emotional experience signals uncertainty, they will unconsciously pull back. On the other hand, steady emotional presence builds trust gradually without force or pressure. This is the hidden structure of human behavior, not what is spoken, but what is felt repeatedly. The human mind does not respond to attraction in a simple or mechanical way. It is not a direct reaction to appearance, words, or actions alone. Instead, every perception is passed through an invisible internal system built from memory, emotional experience, and deeply stored psychological associations. This means that what a person feels in the present moment is often shaped by what they have already lived through in the past. The philosopher William James, often called the father of American psychology, observed that our experience is not a stream of separate events, but a continuous flow shaped by what has gone before. Each new moment is interpreted through the lens of every moment that came before it. When someone meets another person, the brain immediately begins scanning for familiarity. Not necessarily familiarity in a literal sense, but emotional familiarity, tones, behaviors, energy, or patterns that resemble previous experiences. If those past experiences were positive, the mind creates openness and comfort. If they were confusing, unstable, or painful, the mind becomes cautious. Even if nothing objectively wrong is happening in the present interaction, this filtering process happens automatically without conscious permission. A person may think they are reacting to now, but in reality, their emotional memory is quietly influencing interpretation. That is why two individuals can respond so differently to the same situation. One may feel comfort and interest while the other feels distance or hesitation, even though the external circumstances are identical. The psychologist Carl Jung, who explored the depths of the human psyche, understood that the past is not dead. It is not even past. It lives within us, shaping our perceptions, our reactions, and our choices. Emotional association plays an even deeper role. The brain connects certain behaviors, expressions, or communication styles with emotional outcomes stored from earlier life experiences. For example, if someone previously experienced inconsistency in relationships, they may unconsciously associate unpredictability with emotional risk. As a result, even small signs of inconsistency in the present can trigger withdrawal or overthinking. This is also why attraction is rarely stable when emotional experiences are inconsistent. The mind does not rely on single moments. It builds a pattern. One positive interaction can create interest, but sustained emotional inconsistency can slowly overwrite that interest with doubt. Over time, the emotional system prioritizes protection over curiosity. At the same time, positive emotional repetition can rewire perception. When someone consistently feels understood, respected, and emotionally safe, the brain begins to update its associations. What once felt uncertain can gradually start to feel comfortable. This is how trust is formed at a neurological and emotional level. It is not instant, but layered through repeated experiences. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard observed that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. This is precisely what happens in emotional processing. The past shapes the present, and the present shapes the future, but the process is always moving forward. Ultimately, attraction is not just about who someone is in reality. It is equally about what they represent in the mind of the other person. The mind is always comparing the present moment with stored emotional history, and that comparison silently shapes every feeling, decision, and level of connection that follows. People do not respond to what is said as much as they respond to how it makes them feel in that exact moment. Human psychology is deeply emotional before it becomes logical, which means every message, gesture, or silence is first processed through an emotional layer before the mind even begins to analyze meaning. This is why communication is often misunderstood, even when the words are technically clear. At the core of every interaction is emotional impact. A simple sentence can feel warm, distant, comforting, or unsettling depending on tone, timing, and context. The human brain is constantly reading subtle signals, tone of voice, pauses, energy, and consistency. These signals carry more weight than the actual content of words. When emotional signals and spoken words do not align, the mind tends to trust the emotional signal. This is because emotional processing happens faster than rational thinking. The limbic system, responsible for emotional responses, reacts almost instantly while logical reasoning takes more time. As a result, people often feel something about a situation before they can explain why they feel it. That feeling becomes the foundation of their interpretation, even if later analysis tries to justify or correct it. Human behavior is also highly sensitive to emotional consistency. When someone experiences stable emotional energy, whether in communication, presence, or behavior, the mind relaxes and becomes more open. But when emotional signals fluctuate too much, even without intentional harm, the brain begins to question safety and predictability. This questioning often leads to distance, overthinking, or withdrawal. Another important aspect is emotional memory during communication. The brain does not treat each interaction as isolated. Instead, it connects current emotional experiences with past ones. If a certain tone or behavior once created discomfort, even subtle repetition of it can trigger an unconscious reaction. This is why people sometimes react strongly to small things without fully understanding their own response. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote extensively about human nature, observed that what does not kill us makes us stronger. But he also understood that what does not kill us often leaves scars that shape how we see the world. These scars are the emotional memories that color every new interaction. What makes this even more powerful is that emotional impact is often remembered longer than actual words. A conversation may be forgotten in detail, but the feeling it created can last much longer. That emotional imprint then influences future expectations, trust levels, and openness in relationships. In the end, communication is not just about exchanging information. It is about transferring emotional states. People may forget what was said, but they never forget how they felt in your presence. Silence and emotional distance are often misunderstood as emptiness, but in human psychology, they are powerful signals that actively shape perception over time. The mind does not interpret absence as neutral. It interprets it as information. When communication changes in frequency or emotional availability shifts, the brain immediately begins to analyze meaning, even when none is explicitly given. Human beings are wired to seek patterns. When someone behaves consistently, the mind feels stable. But when behavior becomes unpredictable, suddenly warm, then distant, then neutral, the brain starts trying to solve the uncertainty. This process is not intentional. It is automatic. The mind is always trying to protect itself from emotional risk by predicting what might happen next. The philosopher Epictetus, one of the great Stoic thinkers, taught that we should not seek to have events happen as we wish, but to wish them to happen as they do happen. This is a profound insight into emotional processing. When we try to control how others perceive us, when we try to engineer their reactions, we are fighting against the natural rhythm of emotional connection. Distance, even when unspoken, creates space for interpretation. And interpretation is where emotion begins to change shape. If emotional presence once felt strong and suddenly becomes reduced, the brain may register it as a shift in importance or interest, even if the reason is unrelated. This is because the mind does not evaluate intent first. It evaluates impact first. Over time, this creates psychological momentum. Small gaps in emotional consistency begin to accumulate in perception. What was once seen as secure can slowly start to feel uncertain, not because anything dramatic happened, but because the emotional rhythm changed. Human attachment is extremely sensitive to rhythm. How often presence is felt, how consistent attention is, and how predictable emotional responses are. At the same time, silence forces the mind inward. When external communication decreases, people naturally begin to fill the gaps with internal narratives. These narratives are shaped by past experiences, insecurities, and emotional memory. If previous experiences involved inconsistency or emotional confusion, the mind may interpret silence more intensely than intended. This is why emotional distance can have a stronger psychological effect than direct words. Words are processed consciously, but silence is processed subconsciously. It creates space where imagination becomes active, and imagination often carries more emotional weight than reality itself. The philosopher Seneca, another great Stoic, observed that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. This is the danger of emotional distance. When the mind is left to imagine, it often imagines the worst. However, it is also important to understand that not every silence carries meaning. Sometimes silence is just silence. But the human brain, driven by its need for emotional safety, rarely accepts nothing as an answer. It prefers meaning even if it has to create it. In essence, emotional distance does not just reduce communication, it reshapes perception. And once perception shifts, emotional connection is never experienced in the same way again. The psychologist Carl Rogers, who revolutionized the field of humanistic psychology, emphasized that the deepest need of every human being is to be heard and understood. When silence replaces understanding, the connection begins to wither. This is why consistency in emotional presence is so important. It is not about constant communication or endless attention. It is about creating a rhythm that the other person can trust. When a person knows that they can rely on a certain emotional presence, their nervous system relaxes. They do not have to be on guard. They do not have to wonder. They can simply be. And that safety, that predictability, is the foundation upon which deep connection is built. What happens when emotional distance is maintained over a long period? The initial uncertainty can turn into a new kind of stability, but it is a negative stability. The person who once felt close may begin to adjust their expectations. They may start to accept that the emotional presence they once hoped for is no longer available. And in that acceptance, they begin to detach. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic, wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. When a person's thoughts are colored by uncertainty and emotional distance, their soul reflects that. They become more guarded, more cautious, more withdrawn. And what was once a relationship of warmth and connection becomes a relationship of careful negotiation. The damage of emotional distance is not always visible. It does not always show up as an argument or a dramatic breakup. It shows up as a slow fading, a gradual loss of interest, a quiet resignation. This is why emotional awareness is so critical. The people who understand this, who pay attention to the subtle shifts in emotional energy, are the ones who can intervene before it is too late. They can reach out, they can reconnect, they can restore the rhythm before the distance becomes permanent. The philosopher Martin Buber, known for his work on the philosophy of dialogue, distinguished between I-it relationships, where we treat others as objects, and I-thou relationships, where we truly encounter another person. Emotional distance often turns relationships into I-it. The other person becomes a question, a problem, a source of anxiety. But when emotional presence is restored, the relationship becomes I-thou again. Two people truly encountering each other in the fullness of the moment. This is the goal. This is what creates lasting connection. It is not about perfection. It is about presence. It is about showing up again and again with consistency and care. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote that in the midst of winter, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer. That invincible summer is the ability to remain emotionally present even when the world around us is cold. It is the ability to offer warmth even when it is not returned. And that warmth, that presence, is what eventually melts the ice of emotional distance. The human mind is profoundly shaped by emotional patterns. And those patterns are shaped by consistency, by rhythm, by the steady presence of another person. When that presence is withdrawn, the mind begins to wander. And when the mind begins to wander, it often wanders into fear. This is the hidden psychology of emotional distance. It is not about what is said, it is about what is felt. And what is felt, over time, becomes the reality that shapes everything. The philosopher Epictetus taught that it is not what happens to us, but how we react to it that matters. When emotional distance occurs, the reaction is what shapes the outcome. If one reacts with neediness, the distance grows. If one reacts with coldness, the distance grows. But if one reacts with steady, grounded presence, the distance begins to close. Not through force, but through invitation. This is the art of emotional connection. It is the ability to remain open when others close off. It is the ability to stay steady when the world is shaking. And that steadiness, that presence, is what draws people back. It is what makes them feel safe. It is what makes them trust. And trust, as we have seen, is the foundation of everything. When emotional distance becomes a pattern, it can feel permanent. But it is not. The human brain is plastic. It can change. It can update its associations. It can learn new patterns. This is the promise of emotional growth. The past does not have to determine the future. The wounds of yesterday do not have to be the walls of tomorrow. With awareness, with intention, with presence, new patterns can be formed. New trust can be built. New connection can be created. The philosopher Seneca wrote that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. When we waste time on distance, on uncertainty, on fear, we are wasting the opportunity for connection. But when we choose presence, when we choose consistency, when we choose to show up, we are choosing life. We are choosing love. We are choosing the kind of connection that makes life worth living. This is the deeper truth of human psychology. Emotional distance is not the end. It is an invitation to understand. And understanding, when it is genuine, is the beginning of everything. It opens doors that fear had closed. It heals wounds that time had covered. It brings light to the shadows of the mind. And in that light, connection can grow. In that light, relationships can flourish. In that light, love can endure.